Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We are delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Alex Lee of New York University, London, who will be delivering a talk on healing miracles and disability in late medieval Tuscany. Alex is an associate lecturer in liberal studies at NYU London. She received her PhD from UCL in 2017 in Italian studies, and prior to that, received a BA in modern and medieval languages, Italian and French, from the University of Cambridge, and an MA in Medieval and Renaissance Studies from UCL. She also teaches medieval history at King's College London and history of medicine at Goldsmiths, and she's a research assistant at the London School of Economics, working on a project on early modern Italian universities. Her work focuses on religious responses to plague in late medieval Europe, as well as the intersection between popular religion and epidemic diseases in the period. Alex's book on the Bianchi of 1399, a popular religious revival which spread through northern and central Italy, was published in 2021 with Brill, and she has published articles and chapters on plague and religion, religious confraternities, processions, miracles, the color white, and teaching with Twitter. She co-founded the group Medievalists for Disabilities in 2017 and organizes an annual panel on accessibility at the Leeds International Medieval Conference. She's also won the WordPress blog Bianchi 1399 since October 2014. In 2021, she was nominated to UCL Student Choice Roll of Honor for Inspiring Teaching Delivery, and is a Fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Alex, thanks so much for your time. It's fantastic to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. Goodness, what an introduction. So are you happy for me to go ahead?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. There we go. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to be talking to you about disability through a series of different healing miracles in late medieval Tuscany. So the main things we're going to be thinking about are how can we talk about disability in the Middle Ages? So kind of what is disability? What does it mean? We'll think about what are miracles. So what kind of counts as a miracle in this kind of context? I'll introduce you to the Bianchi of 1399 and then to a specific day of miracles. So we're going to be looking at just 5 miracles that happened on one day in August in 1399 as a kind of example of what I want to talk about. And we'll be thinking, so kind of the general theme of what we'll be thinking about is healing disabled people as part of popular religious experience and how that all kind of fits together. So just a kind of snapshot of various models of disability. So these are kind of the traditional ones we think about. So the medical model essentially says that the problem is inherent within a disabled person. It's something that needs to be fixed. This is a model that we're very much moving away from in the modern world. Then we have the social model. So this is something that was created kind of by disabled people for disabled people. This says that it's not a problem within a person. It says that impairments are within a person, but the problems, the disability, is something caused by society and societal expectations. So something like stairs, when we're thinking about buildings, or something like a 9-to-5 workday. So it situates the disability outside the person. It is the world and society's expectations that is disabling, not something inherent within a person. Then we have the religious model. So this is something that kind of, I think, straddles modern and past. So this says that disability is essentially due to God. So there's this idea of divine punishment. So either punishing an individual, punishing someone connected to an individual, that kind of thing. And this also comes with the idea of God not giving someone more than they can handle. So that's how the religious model kind of slots together. The one that I think is most relevant for talking about the medieval past is one called the cultural model. So this essentially says that we should meet different societies and geographies on their own terms. So this isn't just something we can apply to the medieval world. This is something we can think about nowadays as well. And I'll give a couple of examples of that in a minute. But one of the ways that I think the cultural model manifests when we think about the medieval world is terminology. So nowadays we have quite a substantial terminology to think about disability. There are certain words we no longer use, that kind of thing. But the medieval world does use words that makes the modern reader very uncomfortable. So how do we deal with that? So we might sort of feel an urge to say, these are really harmful words now. We need to kind of modernize them for a modern audience, but actually we need to kind of sit with that discomfort in order to be able to see how medieval people talked about disability. These are the terms they're using. We have to analyze these terms. This is the language that's being used. So this is how we can meet medieval society on its own terms in that kind of way. So just briefly to think about language. So we're going to give a couple of modern examples here for context. We have this debate between what's called person-first language and identity-first language. So person-first language says, for example, person with disabilities, person with blindness, person with autism. Then we have identity-first language, so disabled person, blind person, autistic person. And in the UK, at least, there is a general preference for identity-first language. This is kind of generally kind of creeping across other English-speaking communities as well. But the most important thing is how someone wants to refer to themselves. If a disabled person wants to refer to themselves as a person with disabilities, that's absolutely fine and should be respected. The key here is that disabled people get to decide how they want to refer to themselves. So it's not the role of a non-disabled person to say, oh no, this is the language we should be using, but it's disabled people who get to make that choice. We also need to be aware of kind of icky euphemisms, and you can see the picture that I've got here. There's a wheelchair user, and the translation of the Arabic here is people of determination. So these kinds of weird euphemisms like handy capable are things that we now generally try to avoid in the disabled community. Thinking more specifically about the medieval world then, how can we know about disability? Obviously, disabled people have always existed. Impairments have always existed, illnesses have always existed, and actually we have loads of depictions and descriptions. I have just a couple of images here. So the one at the top is from a manuscript, and it shows someone using a mobility aid. Looks a little bit like a wheelbarrow, but all sorts of mobility aids can be seen through images like this. And the one at the bottom is someone with leprosy. So this shows a kind of different side of disability as well. We can also think about mental ill health. So various more textual descriptions there can focus on ideas around that. There's often this connection with miraculous healing. So lots of the sources that we have about disability and illness in the medieval world come from shrines. So this is people going to seek healing for a particular illness or disease, or to give thanks for having been healed for a disease. We can also think about the social impact of disability, and that's something that I'm going to be doing in a bit. We also have ideas around monstrosity. So this is where this idea of language that makes modern readers uncomfortable can come in a bit. So in both Christian and Islamic sources, so this isn't a kind of uniquely Christian idea. One key issue that we have, though, is that source materials written by disabled people are often lacking. And this, again, isn't just unique to Europe. So great work being done on the blind communities in Japan. Again, we don't have many sources created by those blind communities. It's usually people writing about them. And we see that in the Christian and Islamic sources as well. Final thing to mention here for now is retrospective diagnosis. It's so tempting when we see a medieval person with a kind of list of symptoms to say, aha, they must have this thing, and to give them this modern diagnosis. But actually, that's not a very helpful way of thinking about things necessarily. So particularly with mental ill health, lots of these diagnoses are achieved nowadays by talking to someone, and that's not something we can do with medieval people. So it can be helpful to kind of make parallels, but we need to be careful that we're not diagnosing people in the past. What is a miracle? So for me, and for the miracles I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to be taking the chronicler's definition of miracle. If they say it's a miracle, it's a miracle. That's how I'm going to be working with my source materials. If we think about it in a more kind of theoretical way, it's an event caused by intentional supernatural activity. So it's a deliberate act of God. And Benedict Ward has written about this, saying that they are acts of God, not subject to the laws of nature or the usual way in which man acts with nature. So miracles are usually something that's against nature or beyond nature. This is not something that could happen under ordinary circumstances. We like to categorize things. So there are lots of categories that miracles have been put into: healing, weather miracles. So lots of these happen at sea, for example, with storms, involving images or crucifixes, bleeding or sweating or crying, resurrection. So none of these, I'm going to be focusing on healing for today. But I do have some other examples of kind of bleeding and sweating, crucifixes, that kind of thing, if we're interested in questions later. Not all miracles are particularly dramatic. So St. Agnes was sent a tunic and it fitted her perfectly. That was described as a miracle. St. Anselm predicted a big fish would be caught, and indeed a trout of unusual size was caught. So we have a whole spectrum of miracles, from these very dramatic resurrection miracles to these kind of rather more mundane miracles. But all of these are described in our medieval sources as miracles. So now we're going to come on to the Bianchi. So this is the lens that we're going to be thinking about disability and miracles through today. So in 1399, we're about half a century after the Black Death, and plague is starting to sweep through the Italian peninsula once again. So a really logical response to plague in medieval times was religious devotion. This was because plague was believed to be caused by divine anger. So if God is angry because of the sins of humankind, what do you do to fix that? You join religious processions, you pray, you make religious art, all of these things. And so the Bianchi of 1399 are this big religious procession, essentially. It's an itinerant procession. It starts in Genoa and goes eastwards towards Venice and southwards towards Rome. And essentially what you do is you join in for 9 days. So in Genoa, you put on your white robes and you do all the various things. And you go on a little 9-day circular procession and you tell everyone along the way that they need to join in these devotions to stop the spread of plague. And then the people in those towns start their own 9-day processions. And so we have all of these kind of circular 9-day processions around northern and central Italy. The origin of these processions is told through the Tre Pani story, or the story of the 3 loaves. So in image number 1 here, we can see Christ appearing as a pilgrim to a man who is working in the fields. The man does not recognize Christ at this point. The man is asked by Christ for some bread, and he says, "Really sorry, don't have any left." The man says, "Are you sure?" And the man says, "Yeah, no, I've eaten it all." And Christ says, "Will you check?" And so the man checks in his cloak and finds 3 pieces of bread miraculously. Then Christ says, "The bread's a bit dry. Can you moisten it for me, please, so that I can actually eat it?" The worker says, "No water sources nearby, really sorry." Christ says, "Are you sure?" So because he's found the bread, the worker then goes off and does find a stream, as you can see in image 2. And there is a woman dressed in white. This is the Virgin Mary. The man does not recognize her yet. Bit of to and fro here. So the woman says, "Don't throw the bread in the water." So the man goes back to Christ. Christ says, "Do throw the bread in." And then we have a kind of to and fro. Eventually, the man kind of says, "Okay, put 1 bit of bread in." So you can see him holding 1 piece of bread out over the stream. He's going to drop it in. The woman says, "Oh no, I'm actually the Virgin Mary, and you've just condemned 1/3 of humankind to die by plague." Oops. Yeah. So the Virgin was trying to kind of intercede to kind of prevent this from happening. So she then offers these Bianchi devotions as a method through which humankind can redeem themselves. So the worker is told to perform particular actions, which I'll show you on the next slide, and go from town to town and get everyone involved in these religious processions so that this plague won't happen. And we can see in this final image number 4, this witness is going to a town to tell everyone to join in these devotions so that there won't be a plague. So these are all the regulations. This is essentially how to participate in these devotions. You have to confess and receive communion. You have to fast. You have to have bare feet. So in all the images where you can see feet, they will be bare. Usually a period of 9 days. You have to go around shouting misericordia and pace, so penitence and peace. You're not allowed to sleep in a bed or a walled town, and you cannot take the robe off for the duration. So as I've said, most of these are itinerant processions, but we do also have intramural options for those who aren't able to leave their towns. Often these are intra-urban, so going slightly beyond town walls, but kind of remaining within a town's particular territory. So we have this environment of heightened religious devotion where all sorts of kind of miraculous things are going on. Geographically speaking, this is where we're at. So the chronicler, whose work we're going to be using today, is from Pistoia, this top blue blob here, and the miracles happened in Florence, this lower blue blob here. Okay, so we have this heightened religious devotion, all sorts of miracles are happening. They're hoping to prevent plague, and this is one single day, the 20th of August, 1399. So I'm not expecting you to kind of read through all of this and get all of this. Now we're going to be picking up on 5 specific examples. But there are 13 miracles which happen in this day. So our chronicler writing about this is called Luca Dominici. He writes an entire volume of his chronicle about these Bianchi devotions. It's an amazing source. He's talking about hundreds of different miracles, so this really is just a small snapshot of the miraculous events that he is talking about. So we're going to hone in on 5 of these to think about ideas of healing, community, and disability. First up, we have Cristofano di Spinello da Firenze. So Cristofano is paralyzed in 2 arms. Once he had devotedly kissed the crucifix, he healed immediately, and many people were present. So we're just going to kind of hone in on a couple of things that are happening in this source. So firstly, we've got this word rattrato. So this word in modern Italian would be attratto, so we drop the R. And this means specifically the loss of function or mobility because of an impairment. So I've translated that kind of more neatly here as paralyzed. What we also see here is the importance of a crucifix. So this isn't just a miracle that's happening super spontaneously. This one and all the examples we're going to look at today involve a miraculous crucifix as well. And the fact that he is going devotamente, so devotedly, he's kissing this crucifix, suggests that he is eager and willing to do so. This is something that he is seeking out. In terms of the social context, we can see that here as well. We have a couple of details. So the last bit, many people were present. So this isn't something that's happening just for Cristofano. This is a community event. Many people are witnesses to this miracle, which is important. We also know where he's from. He's from the Popolo of Santa Maria sopra Ponte. So this is a church which is probably now deconsecrated and is probably where this blue blob is on this map. So mapping some of these churches is a little bit tricky. But we know that it's on Via Pelliceria in Florence. So we know kind of geographically roughly what's going on. Crucially then, this is not a nameless, faceless person that's just receiving a miracle. He's got a name, he's got a surname, we know vaguely where he lives, and he's actively seeking out this miracle. Unfortunately, his family name has been a dead end for me so far, but this does show that he is kind of part of this community in Florence. Next up, we have a woman. So the first 4 people in this list on the 20th of August, 1399 are men. And they are all healed from paralysis. They all want the healing and actively choose to interact with this crucifix. Here, however, we have Monna Matea d'Andrea, who is also da Firenze, but we don't have any further information. Here, she is possessed by demons and she's taken by force to the crucifix, and once she had kissed it, was immediately free. So this seems a little bit more complex than what's happening with Cristofano. We have the demons. Does this perhaps indicate the need for force? So because she is possessed by demons, she needs to be taken by force here. She is cured. So does this suggest that there was some kind of inexpressible desire within her for healing? And she does kiss the crucifix. So perhaps she lacked the ability to go independently to the crucifix. And she is immediately freed as well. So like the other people described here, pretty much healing is instantaneous. Another key aspect here is the demons. So demonic possession is often a way to explain mental ill health. But usually if it's attributed to demons, the recourse is divine healing. So the only way that Monna Matea d'Andrea was going to be healed from these demons was some kind of supernatural interaction. So had this crucifix not worked, presumably some other devotional attempt would have been tried. Next up, we have another Cristofano. So I'll just read these out and then explain why I've put them together. So Cristofano di Monna Olivatreca is blind in one eye. Once he had kissed the crucifix, he is immediately re-illuminated. And then we have a daughter of Antone, a grocer in Via Maggio, 14 years old, completely deaf, came to our crucifix in Santa Croce, and once she had adored and kissed it, suddenly through the virtue of the crucifix, she regained her hearing. And you'll notice that I was emphasizing the re here. So in our Italian, we've got ralluminato and riebbe l'udire. And so it's these prefixes that I've chosen to focus on here. So they regain their sight and their hearing, these two people. This suggests that there's some kind of restoration going on here. We don't know if these people had acquired these impairments. We don't know anything about their history. We just know what happened to them on this particular day. But this idea of restoration suggests some kind of idea of a natural state going on here. We have an idea also of the role of the crucifix, again, really emphasized with the girl. So the man just kisses the crucifix. Cristofano kisses it and is healed. But the girl adores and kisses the crucifix. And then suddenly, through the virtue of the crucifix, so kind of re-emphasizing here the role of that devotion in the miracle. So it's not just necessarily a small interaction here. This girl has a lengthy interaction with this crucifix in order to be healed. We know quite a lot about where this girl is fitting into her community, though. So the girl's father's address, so he is on Via Maggio, which I've got highlighted here on the left. Sorry, going the wrong way. And they go to the crucifix in Santa Croce. So we have the Basilica di Santa Croce here across the river. So Santa Croce is Santa Croce. Other streets may have moved around a little bit since the medieval period, but she's moving beyond her own parish to go to see this crucifix as well. So we can just about here see where it says Spirito. This is Santo Spirito. So she'll have been in the parish of Santo Spirito, living on Via Maggio. So it's not necessarily that people are just going to a local church. This is suggesting it's much more of an event, something that people are going to. And also the fact that this crucifix is working miracles means that people are more likely to try and touch it, to engage with it as well. Then we come to our most extreme example. So this is a man of 38 or 40 who comes to the hospital of San Gallo, which I've got at the top here in blue. He was blind, non-verbal and deaf, and paralysed in the arms. And here again, we see the language which offends a modern audience. One had never seen something so deformed. Once they had made him embrace and kiss the crucifix, he was restored, his hearing, sight, speech, and his arms were healed. So here we really see the impact of the miracle, but also the way that this giovane is dehumanized. So he is initially called a giovane, a man, or youth, if you like. But then he becomes a cosa, a thing. So this really takes the humanity out of this person, based on essentially this laundry list of impairments that they are living with. He's in a hospital as well, going to this hospital, so suggesting perhaps some kind of medical element there. But again, it's the crucifix, it's the crucial element. This man is embracing and kissing the crucifix, and he is made to embrace and kiss the crucifix. And then everything in the initial list is restored again. So we have rendito, so slightly different formation that we had than with the deaf girl previously. But that's what's going on here. So his kind of long list of impairments are all cured. So what does all of this mean? Essentially, one of the things that we're seeing here is a presentation of successful examples. So Dominici, our chronicler, is only recording those who were successfully healed. It's probably likely that more than 13 people interacted with, or at least tried to interact with, this crucifix. Some of the other images we've seen are kind of people kind of reaching out for these Bianchi crucifixes, trying to interact with them. So 13 is probably a relatively small number in terms of attempted healings, but it's just the successful ones that Dominici is reporting. Why are all of these being reported, and why are all these miracles happening? So something I've been thinking about is inspiration porn. So Gru has several definitions of this, but this is essentially directing the viewer to be inspired by images or by the image in question. So this is essentially non-disabled people being inspired by disabled people going about their daily lives. Sort of not doing anything particularly remarkable, but sort of, oh, if that person can do it and they've got that particular impairment, what am I doing kind of complaining about my life? That's the idea of kind of inspiration porn. Obviously, the stakes are slightly different in the Middle Ages, but I do think that inspiration is a key element here. So there is a key aim of inspiring people to join the Bianchi, and that seems to be what the purpose of lots of these miracles are. So we've been focusing on healing ones, but there are lots of other miracles that kind of aim to give that little extra push to get people to join these devotions. And we saw earlier how important that was, how kind of keen the memory of plague is at this point in time. So we've had the Black Death, and then plague happened about every 10 years after that. So this is something that's very real. And our origin story of the Trepani really kind of hammers that home as something to be wary of. We also see here this idea of the expectation of miracles. So in this period of heightened religious devotion, of course, miracles are to be expected. And so this is something that's being fulfilled here by this laundry list of people. We also see, though, that these people are very firmly inserted into their communities. So I just picked out 5 examples from that long list. But they're all very clearly situated in Florence. Lots of them have at least a parish, sometimes a street name. Lots of them are connected to their family. So lots of them are connected to a father, a mother, parents more generally, this kind of thing. So these people are situated within their families and often slightly broader community structures as well. So that also raises the question of who these miracles are for. So coming back to this idea of inspiration as well. So this idea that people's impairments are being healed for them, yes, but it's also a community event. This is not something that's happening in private. This is something that has an audience, essentially. So it's not just enough for these people to be healed and then that's it. They can get on with their day. That's fine. They're healed, but they also serve this broader purpose within this movement as well. Just to give you a quick example of another miracle. So this is one of spontaneous combustion. So a Bianchi participant is kneeling at an altar here. A man comes and kills him with a sword and spontaneously combusts. So he is punished here. So not all miracles are nice. Like our healing miracles, we definitely have miracles of punishment going on here as well. Okay, let's come briefly and think about some of these crucifixes. So these are 3 crucifixes in Florence, which are allegedly still connected back to the Bianchi. So we can be a little bit skeptical if these were actually the ones carried on the processions in 1399. But this is what they would have looked like. So you can see how easy it would have been to interact with them. They're portable. So crucifixes are essentially used like tourist umbrellas during the Bianchi devotions. So each parish or each group would be led behind a crucifix. So they are usually just taken from parish churches. There's very little lead time with the Bianchi devotions, so there isn't time to make a new crucifix. So it is usually kind of pre-made ones that already exist that are taken on these devotions. So nowadays this connection is often forgotten. So in San Michelino, the people I asked weren't really sure what was going on when I asked them about a Bianchi crucifix, but in the little booklet that they gave me, there was a kind of brief mention of the Bianchi there. The Santa Croce one is no longer in Santa Croce. This one is now in a museum. And in Santa Trinita, So this one you can't see necessarily very well, but this crucifix is still associated with miraculous healing. So around the edge of the crucifix, there are loads of photographs. So this is a really common way of leaving ex votos nowadays. So an ex voto is something that you leave behind at a shrine, either to say thank you, or as a request. So in the medieval period, these would often be made of wax. So if your problem was with your hand, you'd get a hand made out of wax and leave that at the shrine. And nowadays, photographs are a really common thing. So this isn't something that just happens at Santa Trinita. At lots of religious shrines, you'll see photographs being left. So even though the connection to the Bianchi is now somewhat lost, so again, the person I talked to vaguely knew about that, but they knew which crucifix to point me to because of all the ex votos essentially here. So these crucifixes do have this significant power, and sometimes this stretches throughout the centuries as well. So the role of these crucifixes in these miracles is really undeniable. So to wrap up then, what we really see here then is disabled people within their communities. They have names, they have relatives. We can see what's going on with them. Most of them are choosing to come and interact with this crucifix, it seems. Most of them are coming under their own steam to interact with this crucifix. We also see a different language around impairment and a connection with religious healing. So one key takeaway, I think, is that sources like this really provide us with key insights into disabled people in the medieval past. So this is a really key way that we can learn about them. So often, as I said before, it's these hagiographical sources. So things like lists of miracles from shrines, but chronicles can also be a really key part of this story as well. So we really need to drill down into the language, meet the medieval period on its own terms when we're thinking about these things. So kind of learn to kind of deal with that difficulty around the language, but to kind of interpret that, to think about how they are describing these disabled people, and also the emphasis that they're placing on a cure here as well. Okay, and I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was a really fascinating deep dive into the Bianchi and the kind of wider questions that it brought up about disability in the Middle Ages. I'd be interested, firstly, to explore a bit more about the person behind the source, Luca de Domici. I'd be interested to know, do we know much about like his background? And secondly, the time between the procession and when he was sort of writing this down and recording the miracles?
Yeah. So Domenici is a notary. So he has a job essentially in the government of Pistoia, kind of writing official documents, that kind of thing. So he is someone of kind of significant social standing. But beyond that, we don't really know that much about him. And as for the when, I'd say pretty soon afterwards. Like this is a kind of diary, kind of day-by-day account that he is writing. I'm very skeptical about the numbers that he is presenting. He's like, yeah, 5,000 Bianchi turned up in this place on this day. Happy to take that with a pinch of salt, but the rest of it, kind of the level of detail, suggests that this is something that he is writing kind of as he is going along.
I see, absolutely, and probably, I guess, just exaggerating things just as
Oh,
one would want
absolutely,
to
yeah.
do. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Again, big religious possession. I can imagine that, he'd want to kind of play up how many people there were, how many people were being healed. I can absolutely see that like that would have been front and center of what he did. And do we hear of any failed miracles, either like from this source or like kind of externally? Or is that something that doesn't really crop up in source material?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. So there are miracles that aren't very nice, but I don't think they're necessarily failed miracles. So like the punishment one, like the spontaneous combustion one. So I think it's more that failed miracles wouldn't necessarily be written down because the types of sources we're thinking about aren't interested in that. So if you're kind of writing down a list of miracles that have been performed at a saint shrine, you're not going to write down the unsuccessful ones.
Naturally, yeah, I can absolutely see that. So it's kind of, I was curious to see if like that did crop up at all, but I completely see what you mean that like there wouldn't be any kind of incentive to kind of record that stuff, right?
No, and we don't have, as I said, we don't have many accounts from disabled people themselves, so it's not kind of today I woke up and I went to go to the shrine to try to get this thing healed.
Yeah, definitely. And on that note, I appreciate that it's sort of far and few between, but where we do have sources written by disabled people, how does that kind of play out, kind of the way that they kind of write about themselves and their disabilities?
Yeah, so again, kind of nothing is specifically coming to mind apart from Marjorie Kemp. And
Mhm.
again, there we have to be really careful about retrospective diagnosis. So Marjorie Kemp wrote what's believed to be the first autobiography, and while she didn't physically write it down, she's the first woman to do something like this. So she dictated it, and kind of people wrote it down for her. She writes a lot about kind of her inner turmoils. So she's been, again, diagnosed with things like postpartum depression, that kind of thing. She cries a lot, has these very kind of deep, visceral religious experiences. So she kind of describes her life and her experience. And it's more that we kind of have to read around that and interpret that. So it's not kind of, I woke up today and I felt sad. It's kind of, I went to Jerusalem and did all of these things. And she describes how she's feeling sometimes along the way, how other people react to her, that kind of thing. So,
Mhm.
like, they're not the kind of things that tell us what we want to know, if that makes sense. Like, we want to know kind of what symptoms are you feeling, all of these kinds of things, kind of with a modern kind of medical hat on. And it's more about kind of reading between the lines to think about what the medieval experience was and kind of if we can kind of draw parallels to modern ideas.
I see, and I think you might have touched on this previously already, but I appreciate that there's a real tightrope that you have to walk between, as you say, sort of reading between the lines and trying to understand what's going on here, but not sort of retroactively trying to diagnose the author. Out of interest, is there any particular kind of way of doing that where you're able to kind of glean things, without kind of making assumptions, or is it just kind of a case of just kind of doing what you can, sort of, on an ad hoc basis, just trying to kind of get what you're able to?
Yeah, so it can be really tempting to sort of be like, oh, this person had this thing. But like that I think is also a helpful starting point as well, because it kind of makes you kind of make that connection, and then you have to kind of backpedal a little bit and kind of see what the source is actually telling you. One of the chapters in the book that I'm editing, the Towards an Accessible Academy, by Edward Mills, talks about an idea of autism-like. So he's saying, lots of these nuns writing about themselves sure do seem to fit the criteria for an ASD diagnosis nowadays. We can't talk to these nuns, so we don't know, but we can see lots of these kind of shared characteristics. So this kind of suffix like, I think, can be very helpful to be thinking about these things. So particularly when like neurodivergent and disabled people can see themselves in the past, I think that's something really helpful. So like again, like it's really carefully treading that line. It's not saying that these people are definitely autistic. It's saying so Ed is writing from a position saying kind of as an autistic person, he thinks like he's feeling kind of some parallels between kind of modern experiences of autism and what's happening in these medieval texts.
Ah, that's really interesting. So kind of crossing over the experience, kind of comparing,
Yeah.
say, his experience to theirs and saying, well, okay, we can't tell for certain,
Mm.
but there's a parallel there which we can certainly, kind of think about.
Yeah, but unpick and kind of dig into a little bit more deeply. Yeah, absolutely.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I guess just kind of broadening out for a second, how did this kind of methodology develop? And what's kind of been the historiography of a history of disabilities in the Middle Ages?
So there's a really great volume called A Cultural History of Disability in the Middle Ages by Bloomsbury, which I really recommend to anyone kind of like wanting to think about this kind of from a beginner's standpoint. So people like Rick Godden, who I cited when I was talking about the cultural model, Jonathan Shue, lots of people writing about disability now. So I think this is a field that's kind of absolutely kind of like blooming at the moment. Lots of
Mhm.
people are kind of starting to think in these terms now. Irina Metzler was one of the first people to be thinking about these things. Yeah, so it's something that kind of has been a little bit disjointed, I guess. So everyone has been kind of doing disability studies in their own discipline, so like literature, history, all of these kinds of things. But now I think we're starting to think a little bit more broadly in terms of kind of disability and medieval studies rather than necessarily just kind of one single discipline. So kind of connecting the dots a little bit as well.
Fantastic. That's really encouraging to hear. Yeah. And are there any kind of particular areas that you want to see kind of explored more as the field develops?
So I think like these ideas of neurodivergence, I think are really interesting when we're thinking about the medieval period. And again, for me, something I'm thinking about a lot is language. So like I have a sort of languages background and then kind of sidestepped a little bit into history. So thinking about specifically the language that's used to talk about infirmity, impairment, illness, that kind of thing. So that's something that I'm definitely interested in looking into more, and just on a more global level as well. So I sort of was vaguely talking about kind of Japan and Islamic examples as well. So I think there's lots of work happening on this global stage as well. So, and kind of just thinking about that more broadly as well. So being able to think about it on this global stage rather than kind of this traditionally kind of European stage we tend to think about things on.
That'll be really exciting to see. I know that obviously global history is starting to really kind of burgeon
Which
now.
is great. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. For sure, for sure. And so kind of seeing that kind of brought into kind of the field of global history, I think will be really interesting. Yeah, and hopefully we'll start to see that as the field progresses. Absolutely. Now going back to the Bianchi ceremony itself, there's lots of kind of elements of that, just kind of listening to it, that really intrigued me. And I think one of them was kind of the process that people went through to be healed. I know that we see sort of elements of being willingly devoted, of the actual action of embracing and kissing the crucifix and being devoted to it. And I'd be interested to see. I know that it's perhaps a little tricky to pick out, just kind of based on the source itself and what we have. But is there anything that do you think there's sort of any one particular act that kind of combines together all that healing, or is it kind of a mixture of kind of different things coming together?
So I think so something often happens to the crucifix first. So often these crucifixes will bleed and then become what I call open for business. So often there will be one miracle where the crucifix bleeds and then people will interact with that crucifix that's now open for business open for the business of miracle making. So they're interacting with this kind of like viscerally obviously miraculous object with the blood there as well. And then it just depends, really. So sometimes touching is enough, sometimes being in the presence of the bleeding crucifix is enough. Sometimes, so one of the examples has to interact twice with the crucifix. So sometimes once is not enough. So it seems to depend on the person, the type of miracle that's happening, and I guess maybe the level of miracle that's happening as well. So if it's something that's kind of straightforward, or if it's something that's a little bit more tricky.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that yeah, kind of depending on like kind of the size of the miracle and kind of what they intend to achieve through it. And I'm interested that it's almost as if like it's when the crucifix bleeds that like sort of miracles become available, as you say. And I'm interested, like, was that something that happened spontaneously, or is it something that people could say, intercede for, and it could sort of be replicated?
So it's not always that a crucifix bleeds. That's just some of the time. Sometimes the
Oh,
crucifix is
okay.
just kind of interacted with without the bleeding.
Mhm.
But yes, so there's an example in Borgo Borgiano, which is near Pistoia, where a man will not make peace with his wife. So one of the key tenets of the Bianchi devotions is peacemaking. So you're supposed to make peace with everyone around you. Like warring factions in Italian cities make peace. Like this is a really large scale operation. But the man will not make peace with his wife. So these Bianchi participants come into this church of San Pietro, and they kind of kneel before the crucifix and kind of pray to the crucifix. And then the crucifix starts bleeding. From its head, from the wounds of Christ, all of these things, lots of blood. And then in the drops of blood that are falling onto the marble on the floor, kind of little faces of Christ can be seen. Then the man is convinced to make peace with his wife. So there's kind of lots of things going on there. But yeah, so kind of prayer can be used to kind of provoke this bleeding.
Ah, that's fascinating stuff. Yeah. I guess one thing that was sort of interesting kind of with that is I know that sometimes, miracles could be sort of spontaneous events that people kind of, later praise, but it's sort of really interesting that it's something that I guess is part of the process and as part of, as you say, that heightened religious devotion, that it's something that people can sort of bring into being through their kind of devotion. Is that the sense that we get from this?
So I think miracles are definitely to be expected here.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, so like our chronicler does have a little bit of skepticism sometimes. So
Mhm.
most of these miracles are just kind of reported miracle, 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 ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. But there's two examples that come to mind where that's not quite so kind of clear cut. One is resurrection. So 16 years prior to the Bianchi devotions, a man murders a small child. During the Bianchi devotions, he repents and tells the parents where the child is buried. They go and dig him up. The little boy is sitting there kind of as he was 16 years ago, dressed in white, holding a candle, and says, Babbo, gridiamo misericordia. So, Daddy, let's go shout misericordia. So, let's go join the Bianchi devotions. Um, our chronicler says at the beginning of that, si dice, okay, it is said that. Like,
Mm.
it's really rare for him to use that. So, basically, none of the other miracles are kind of prefixed with this. And then at the end, so this miracle happens in Chianti, they take the miracle to Rome to be ratified. So this isn't something that's kind of reportedly happening with lots of the other ones. So kind of there is this kind of level of skepticism. There's also a fake bleeding crucifix, which I think in a way is there to give credence to all the other bleeding crucifixes. Like kind of the authorities saying we are really on kind of red alert for this. Like we have found the fake one. And so I think it kind of legitimizes all of the other ones. So this fake one reported briefly by Dominici, but it's in a couple of other sources as well. There's a man who is also pretending to be John the Baptist, but that's kind of by the by. Has this crucifix, and it's discovered that within it there's a little pouch, and it's filled with cinnabar, which is a mercury ore pigment, and oil, and so it can be squeezed and it comes out and it looks like blood. So like miracles are absolutely to be expected, but we do have this kind of level of skepticism that suggests that Dominici is being slightly careful about what he is including in his chronicle. But it is really kind of magpie-like in what he's including. Like there are letters from other places, that kind of thing written in.
Yeah, absolutely. And dare I suggest that it's perhaps sort of expected that there would be attempts to kind of counterfeit miracles, or perhaps kind of stories where I think just thinking about the boy that was kind of resurrected, it almost seems a bit too good to be true, almost kind of fits the narrative a bit too well. Yeah.
So potentially yes, but I also think that would kind of go against the spirit of the devotions, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay.
So like
Yeah.
it would like the crucifix was kind of not quite obviously counterfeit, but it was found out to be counterfeit. So I think you'd have to be really careful about kind of treading that line if you wanted to kind of talk about a fake miracle, or to kind of try to fake a miracle. Lots of them sound really fake, from a modern perspective. Like
Mhm.
there's one where a man doesn't want to participate, so he slices some meat. You're not supposed to be eating meat, you're supposed to be fasting, and blood pours out all over the table, all over the floor, more blood than could possibly have been contained within the meat. That's sort of hard to believe from a modern standpoint. Um, but our chronicler is kind of asking us to believe that, to say kind of this happened and kind of these are the consequences. That means it's so important to participate in these devotions. So I think that's the kind of key thing here. We can absolutely be skeptical about these miracles, and I don't think any of the chroniclers are eyewitnesses to any of these miracles. So they're kind of already a step removed. So we can absolutely be skeptical. But I don't get the sense that the chroniclers necessarily are making them up. So they might be stories circulating from elsewhere, if that makes sense, that the chroniclers are
Mhm.
including. So I wonder if that has something to do with it. So the man with the meat cutting is in the north and is reported by a chronicler in Lucca. So kind of again quite near Florence.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. Just kind of seeing how that all kind of plays out. Yeah, and as you say, kind of how it kind of gets recorded.
Mm,
And I'm interested as well. I know that there was certainly with one of the first miracles, there's this sort of emphasis on there being kind of witnesses.
mm.
Do we get the impression that that was a kind of core element of the healing process as well? Like people actually seeing this and kind of, attesting to it happening?
So not explicitly with the healing miracles, but there is one instance where we still have the document, or at least a copy of a document, where people are attesting to having seen a miracle happen. Can't remember where off the top of my head, but I think it was another one of these bleeding crucifixes. And so they're really keen to kind of get the right number of witnesses to attest to it, that kind of thing. So there is a kind of really clear process for attesting miracles in the medieval period, and it's not quite clear if all of these Bianchi ones necessarily went through that. But we do have one example where they are really kind of actively trying to stick to those kind of clear regulations.
I see. That's really interesting. I was hoping to perhaps slightly broaden out the discussion a little bit.
Mhm.
And I'd be interested to hear. I know that we've seen a bit about sort of the healing process itself, but I'd be interested on a more kind of broad basis. What do we know about the experience of disabled people in late medieval Tuscany and the way that they were kind of broadly viewed by society? I appreciate you've sort of touched on that a bit towards the start when you talked about the way that they're kind of referred to with languages and things like that. But I'd be interested to sort of understand a bit more about sort of, what the experience would have been like day to day, as far as, of course, we can actually kind of bring that kind of bring that to life, as it were.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm still kind of thinking about. So I don't have a kind of definitive answer yet, but I think essentially the answer is it depends.
Mhm,
So it depends on the nature of the impairment. It depends on how the impairment was acquired.
mhm,
So say for example, like these are examples from the ancient world rather than the medieval world, but Sallust writes about a man called Sertorius who was wounded in battle and wore his battle scars with pride. So the way that that visible difference was acquired is a kind of important part of the story. So like we see in the examples I presented how these people are part of the community. They're kind of someone's daughter,
mhm,
someone's aunt, this kind of thing. So I think it just depends often on kind of individual circumstances. Money is going to be important as well. And kind of like this idea of productivity, perhaps a little bit. So this is something that really kind of kicks in after the Industrial Revolution, which is why disability in the past looks slightly different, feels slightly different, is understood in a different way. So this idea that kind of people must be useful in order to kind of have value. So this isn't something necessarily that we see throughout all societies in the past.
mhm,
Um, but kind of whether or not they can support themselves, this kind of thing is going to be an issue. Lepers are an interesting kind of tangent here. So lepers often live in communities. So this idea of a lazzaretto, so these are often kind of repurposed during plagues for kind of victims of the plague.
mhm,
But lepers would often kind of live in these community settings together. And medieval people were actually quite good at diagnosing leprosy. So
mhm,
the work of Carol Rawcliffe here, I think, is interesting. So that's on Norwich, so that's on England rather than Italy. But kind of based on bioarchaeological evidence, there is quite a lot of leprosy in former leper communities.
mhm. Yeah, that's interesting stuff. And I guess just one thing that kind of sprung to mind, just as we were kind of mentioning the fact that obviously, your kind of your wealth and your background would have kind of an impact on that. What were the sort of backgrounds of people partaking in these Bianchi process? Like, was it something that kind of cut across different strata of class, or did it tend to be people from a particular background that participated in them?
So the idea is everyone.
Hmm.
So everyone is supposed to join the processions. So if you're going on an itinerant procession, usually certain groups are exempt from processions. So pregnant people, children under 14, um, disabled people, so people with specific impairments are often excluded. So these are people who are also kind of exempt from participating in lots of liturgical processions throughout the year. So towns usually have a series of liturgical processions, and there's often a fine for non-attendance. And the groups that are exempt from that are also exempt from the Bianchi processions. So they borrow a lot of stuff from pre-existing liturgical traditions. But no, it's everyone. So kind of
Hmm.
men, women, children, people from all social statuses, clergy are getting involved, town councils are getting involved, the Pope gets involved once the processions reach Rome. So Like obviously there are some people who don't participate, but at least the impression that the sources are trying to give is that everyone was participating.
Mm-hmm. I see. That's really interesting. And when we kind of talked about elements of resistance to participating, where people were perhaps kind of less keen, do we get a sense of like why people would have been less inclined to partake in this?
Yeah. So on a citywide scale, people are scared about depopulation.
Hmm.
So in Lucca, foreign Bianchi come in, everyone is proselytized, ready to go. Then the Anziani, the town council, decides, no. So they shut the town doors. Some people have already managed to get out to kind of escape before that happens, and they can't be persuaded to turn back. So they kind of go out and do a Bianchi procession. And so the town of Lucca is really worried that if everyone leaves, there won't be enough people to defend the town if something happens. And in fact, this happens to a town near Orvieto. People leave for the processions and it is taken over. Otherwise, I guess people just aren't scared enough of the threat of plague. Maybe that's something, but I really do think that peer pressure is a big thing that's happening here.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
thinking about it from a kind of modern standpoint, sort of everyone is participating, kind of why is that person not participating? It's a little bit like, the clap for the NHS thing
Oh,
that was happening during COVID.
yeah.
Like the social pressure with that kind of, ooh, why isn't number four out clapping? What's going on there? So this kind of importance of participating to kind of as part of the social contract as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really interesting parallel that you've kind of drawn there. I think, especially just kind of, thinking back to COVID and how I think it did create this, interesting kind of social kind of scenario where people would kind of judge those that didn't kind of come out and kind of clap for the NHS.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think it really, and again, I think just kind of thinking about the way that kind of it shows all the kind of good happening in the kind of sources, all the miracles being attributed to. I think my impression, as somebody who's perhaps kind of less kind of familiar with the text, is that that seems to be what's being communicated here. Like, so they want people to kind of, they want to kind of show what a fantastic thing this is and why people should be joining and coming along to this.
Yeah, so they're definitely presented as a good thing. So the sources are rarely kind
Mhm.
of presented as a kind of active, you must join now, because they're usually retrospective.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but we do have some examples of songs, for example, that were written during the processions that are often quite kind of join in.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. There is one element as well with the story of the three breads that really intrigued me. And it was that sort of argument between kind of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, and the way that when the gentleman kind of goes to put the bread in the water, almost condemns a third of the country to plague. Um, I'm I'm absolutely fascinated by that. Like, do we know anything at all about like the origins behind that? Like, what was the kind of significance of what was sort of going on there? Because it seems like certainly, I mean, certainly just to me, again, who's somebody who's less familiar, it seems like a very unusual episode, kind of in the kind of build up to it.
Yeah, so I did try to find precedent for this story, but no, this is like obviously like elements of it, like bread and that kind of thing, obviously we see elsewhere, but I couldn't really find kind of precedent for this story specifically. Um, and we see that also in the way that it was kind of forgotten. So there's a painting of the story in Terni, which became known as the story of the three golden apples. So this is not a kind of common story motif. Like now it's been reattributed to the Bianchi. But essentially like the key underlying message is Christ is angry. Christ is really, really angry with humankind. So that's why he wants the worker to put the bread into the water,
Ah,
so that
right.
humankind will be condemned. And the Virgin is in her usual intercessory role. So she is kind of mediating.
Mhm.
She's trying to stop humankind kind of messing up, essentially, and doesn't quite manage.
Doesn't quite get there, but
Yeah, so there are a couple of other origin stories as well. That one's the most common one, but there's another one which
Mhm.
includes God, God the Father and Christ. And God is really angry there. So this idea of kind of divine anger causing plague, I think, is the kind of key idea here.
I see, I see. And I'd be interested as well, like with the healing miracles that we see, are there any particular disabilities that tend to get written about particularly frequently? Are there any that sort of come up more regularly than others?
So I think it's a lot like biblical miracles.
Hmm.
So we see kind of deaf people being healed, blind people being healed, paralyzed people being healed. So there are lots of kind of parallels with the kind of types of miracles that we see in the Bible. That's what I've seen in the Bianchi miracles, at least. Um, Trying to think of other ones in terms of healing. No, it's mostly kind of things like paralysis, kind of issues with limbs, that kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah, I see what you mean, and almost kind of allusions back to kind of the sort of healing miracles that we see in the Gospels and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's something that people kind of have template for, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So they're familiar with these stories from the Gospels, and then these are the kind of things that they're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And just to round off the discussion, if people want to explore this topic in more depth, or learn more about the history of disability in the Middle Ages, I know you've already mentioned that fantastic kind of book to get people started, but are there any other kind of good sort of starting points for learning more about this subject?
Ooh, putting me on the spot. Here a little bit. So I think uh, I'm not sure how I'm going to get these people's names right now. Um, ah, I'm afraid their names aren't coming to me off the top of my head, or at least not their surnames. So I can only remember people's first names, and that's not very useful for a citation. Um, but there is lots of just great disability stuff happening. Oh, Alicia Spencer Hall.
Mhm,
Um, so they have a chapter in the cultural history of disability book, and they're also doing kind of work more generally around kind of chronic pain, that kind of thing, in the Middle Ages. Um, and she also has a blog which kind of breaks things down a little bit more. She's written about Marjorie Kemp, for example. Um, yeah, I'm struggling now to come up with names off the top of my head, but I'm happy to pop things over in an email if you want to include them in the description.
That would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Brilliant. I'm afraid that brings us up to the end of our discussion today, which is a pity because it's been such a fascinating deep dive into a really interesting subject. I encourage everybody at home to check out Bianchi 1399. It's a really good blog. And Alex, I'd like to thank you so much for your time this evening. It's been brilliant to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been great to be here.
And thank everybody, and thank everybody at home for listening. Hope you join us for the next episode. Thanks very much and take care.